Hi and welcome back. It's still week 1 in English 1A. I wanted to make a video for you with some of the lecture slides that kind of takes us through the first reading and assignments and some background on reminders about note-taking and also just about how to some strategies about writing essays with some examples with the content you're going to be using. So I hope things are going well. I really liked the online discussion so far. You guys seem really connected and you're doing a good job. Make sure you do respond to other students, not just posting for yourself, and ask some questions of each other. Continue to do that. So great job so far. So I wanted to start with this idea of posing to you a question about stereotypes. And so I'm going to show you several pictures of a person and see like what you might think about this person just from the photograph and how that might change based on the photograph. So you'll see these two, and this is the same person in both of these photographs. And then this is also the same person. And so in these different photographs, we notice like if they were seen in isolation, we might have a very narrowed view, like one story, one assumption or one judgment about a person. And we might make judgments about their marital status, about their political affiliations. We might make all kinds of adjustments about their ethnicity, their age, all kinds of things. And so it's something to consider when you're looking at a person to see like what makes you kind of make these assumptions and judgments yourself. And they might not be ones that you act upon or vocalize, but they still could be impacting you, and other people make the same ones to you. And that could be a future employer, or a teacher, a friend, a classmate, a family member even. So it's something to consider. Another place you might have seen this happen is with selfies. And I don't know if you remember this, but after the Michael Brown case, when he was shot by police officers, they really focused on photographs of him in the media that were more menacing looking and taken out of context. And so there was a hashtag that went around after that saying, "If they gun me down," and then people would post pictures of themselves in different situations and different events and say like, okay, which one would they choose, to kind of show like we are not just one photograph of us, we are way more than that, and we're all very complex, and it's hard to remember that sometimes, but it is a good reminder when we're looking at stereotypes that can come up. So there is a stereotype video here. It's humorous, it's funny, it's like 2 minutes long, but it brings up some good points. I have it in the slides in the module that you can take a look at. I recommend clicking on it and watching it. It's sort of fun, but it also brings up some interesting issues that might relate to things that might seem innocuous or harmless, but that do come up and do impact our views of others and our views of ourselves. So I want to shift now to note-taking. A lot of times when we start reading, we get very excited and then we run out of gas as we're reading because we lose track or we get distracted or we're bored. So I want to make sure you think really hard about your note-taking. And you can do different types. Not everyone does the same type. I'm not a great note-taker in a classroom when I'm a student. I have a hard time listening and then turning that off, keeping that open and continuing to take notes. I kind of shut down when I take notes and I don't hear and I miss chunks, and so you have to think about what works best for you while you're reading, what kind of note-taking to use. So it might look like this. These are double journal entry journals. You could also do there's different kinds of like Cornell notes where you have passages on one side and your reactions on the other, and maybe summarization at the bottom, or something like the slide here. That could be helpful to you, but try to come up with a system that works for you. Some people like to color code things. Some people like to use outlines. It's up to you. When you are annotating a text, you might want to physically annotate in the book. I like doing that as well. And then you can kind of have a conversation with that author as you're working through it, asking questions. If you don't write anything in a book and you are reading it, you will forget. You won't remember what you've read. And so it's a waste of time. It'll take you way longer. You'll spend 2 or 3 times longer than everyone else in reading if you don't take notes while you read. So you have to come up with some system. Some people don't, they want to sell their books back, or they don't want to mark in their books, so they use post-it notes, and that can be really helpful too. So consider a system and try to stick to that and keep it up. Okay, next I want to shift to summary, writing your summary and whistling Vivaldi. So I've asked you as like a diagnostic exercise to read the introduction to the book and to write a summary of it, like a 1 to 2 page summary. Double space is fine. MLA format. You're going to upload it to Canvas. And I've on Canvas where the link says Introduction to Summary, I've put some guidelines for writing a summary there, but some basics. It's due July 8th on Canvas by midnight. You want to review the guidelines on Canvas. Be sure to have the title of the text italicized and the author's full name when you first introduce it, and main points about Steele's introduction. Remember, this isn't an essay, so you don't have to have like a hook and all these things. You just have to summarize. So if you can summarize by just introducing the book at the very beginning, that's fine. You know, in Claude Steele's whistling Vivaldi, he does what, right? And then use your own words, check for grammar, spelling, capitalization. If you use outside sources to try to write this, it'll show up on Turnitin, so you don't want to do that. So you want to use your own words in describing the introduction to this text. Let me know if you have questions about that too, and I'm going to give you feedback on it and grading it to give you feedback on things to look for in your writing. So try to spend a little time on it. Okay, so when we're looking at the text whistling Vivaldi, there's some important terminology you need to know. So there's some differences between these 3 items are really important. So first is stereotype. That is the actual assumption or judgment. I'm going to give examples of each of these in just a minute. That comes from someone that makes an association with you, or assumption or judgment based on what they believe is your participation in a particular group. And then they make a judgment or assumption about that. Stereotype threat is when there's an obstacle. It could be direct, or it could be in the air, and it is an obstacle that's put there that creates a challenge for the person being stereotyped. In Claude Steele's book, he talks about when he was a kid in the 50s and realized that he couldn't swim except for on Mondays at the public pool. That was a direct sort of obstacle or stereotype threat. And in the air one is one that no one's actually blocking you, but it kind of creates and it feels like there's a difference there that you notice, and so you make changes. Thirdly is identity contingency. Those are the changes or the things you do in order to keep your identity intact. So it's an action, a coping mechanism, or maybe a hoop you have to jump through. So hey, let's look at some examples. So for stereotypes, some examples would be Asians are good at math. That's an assumption. And even though it's a positive assumption, it can be equally as destructive for people in that group. Second, like the white basketball player will be less successful recruit than the African American player. That's a judgment that's been made based on race. So that's something to consider as far as an example of judgment versus assumption. Stereotype threat. Here's some examples. If women are not invited to join the wrestling team, that's an overt threat. That's an overt obstacle. And in the air one would be like, let's say you're a man of color and you want to become a nurse, and you go in to apply for the job at the hospital and you realize there's only white women. And so even though no one's saying you can't apply, you are getting this feeling like maybe you're not wanted, and maybe there's some stereotypes about people of color and men of color in particular as nurses. Identity contingency examples. So what happens is what you do in order to help you cope with this identity issue when the threat comes. So you might get angry, you might avoid the people or the conversation, you might have apathy where you just sort of like pretend like you don't care and you just don't respond. You might accept it, which means you might start believing that stereotype to be true about yourself or others. Or you might over effort to try to disprove or debunk it. So for instance, let's say someone assumes you're poor. So then in a conversation, you might really make an extra effort to suddenly start talking about a vacation you're going to take to Europe. And that way, even though it's indirect, you're kind of letting them know you have money And so that would be like an over effort in some way to prove it. But it could be at school, it could be in a variety of circumstances. So what I want you to do right now is like hit pause and in a second, and I want you to do a 10-minute writing in your notebook, and I want you to try to brainstorm first of all, list all the aspects of your identity. So some of you put some things there, but put your age, your race, your culture, your gender, your politics, your religion, your beliefs, size, gender, just anything that comes up. I've had students do it about what music they listen to, or about being agnostic or atheist or Hindu. I've had students do it about being a vegetarian, or about being about sexual orientation. I mean, there could be a variety of things. So you just list all of those, and then circle one or two that stand out to you as the one where you've probably faced the most stereotype threat. And then I want you to, after that, take a few minutes and try to explain one or two or three of these encounters or events you've had. What person, who said it, where was it at, what was the situation, how did you respond, and what happened. And that piece of information, that writing, will go actually directly into this essay. So you want to write it out and get all the details in there. After you've done that and you turn this back on, you also need to be thinking about reading, if hopefully you're starting to read Whistling Vivaldi. And after the introduction, you get into the body paragraphs. The discussion questions are due on the 7th. The sum that will really help you in writing this paper are these 4. So you might be thinking about kind of the identity contingencies he mentions, how that relates to you. You might also be thinking about examples like the kid who's the white kid in the all-black class and what happens to his behavior in the classroom. You might be thinking about, some of the Jane Elliott experiment, which we'll talk more about later, and other issues that pop up. So try to keep track of the studies and things that come up that really stand out to you when you're answering these questions, because those could also be helpful for you in your essay. Okay, so vocabulary. As you probably noticed when you're starting to do the discussion questions, there's vocabulary. Part of your discussion questions, like getting those done, is you have to put a part of speech and a quick synonym or definition. If you use 5 of those vocabulary words from the list that's on the discussion questions successfully, and you bold them in your essay, you can get some extra points. So you might want to consider doing that. Okay, I just put the essay prompt here again, and just to kind of go over it one more time, you are going, after reading the first 3 chapters and thinking about your own stereotype threat issues you've dealt with, I want you to analyze 1 or 2 major aspects of your identity, and there's a list there you can choose from. Explain the contingencies involved in that identity. What have you had to do? What hoops have you had to jump through? What kind of stereotypes have been there? How did you navigate those? Discuss whether it was a direct stereotype threat or in the air. And then you want to connect it back to Steele. In each paragraph, you want to go back to Steele to talk about things that connect to your experience as well. And that's the hardest part of this essay, I think. And I'll give you examples of how to do that. Finally, you want to conclude by looking at how Steele's research kind of makes you feel now that you've thought about it. So you can't really write the conclusion until you've written the rest of the essay on this one, because you have to really think hard about how you feel now that you know. Okay, so for writing the essay, there's a few reminders I want to go through and some examples to kind of help you get started. So first are thesis statements. That's the core of your paper, heart of your paper. I'm going to be speaking generally here. There are different types of thesis statements you normally will write, either policy, value, or fact. Policy is normally a should statement, a call for action. Value is normally showing comparison, something's better or worse, more or less effective than something else. Fact is a really assertive one, and now normally you'll hear thesis statements aren't facts, which is true. But when you assert something so aggressively, and you say this is this, when actually it could be challenged, but you're stating it so aggressively that, or assertively that, or confidently that it sounds like a fact, that is a different type of thesis statement, and it requires the most proof because it's so assertive. So here are 3 examples, one of each, that all have to do with stereotypes and things that we've been talking about for this topic. So the first one, India should change its law against same-sex relationships to improve its human rights standing with tech firms with which it does business. That was sort of came up recently when the Prime Minister of India had visited. Value, public high schools that employ full-time cops are more likely to send their students to criminal justice system. That was like a more likely, you'll see the comparison there. In fact, stereotype threat is a major factor of poor student performance. So if I stated that, then I'd have